I have an embarrassing admission, but I think it's an embarrassing admission that many of you might actually agree with. And that is that National Treasure is one of my favorite movies ever. It's like the best, worst movie in the world, right? It's completely ridiculous, but also awesome. And if you remember National Treasure 2, which is also pretty good, but nothing's ever as good as the first National Treasure. The whole point of the story is he's trying to disprove a misinformation about his grandfather. They say that his great-great-great-grandfather was involved in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And so he goes on this quest to prove that wrong and winds up finding fabulous treasure anyway, which again, if you ignore how ridiculous that plot line is, it gets down to something that probably all of us have in common, which is at some point in your family history, there's an ugly story. At some point, there's probably something that's not really good. Ruthie's, I think, is it your mother's side? I think it's her mother's side. Hopefully she's not listening to this. But they're very proud that actually in their family origin, their family history, is that there were very well-known sheep thieves at one point. And they're just very happy with this for some strange reason. But being a sheep thief that's not that embarrassing. But some of us, if you're like me, my family has the skeletons in the closet today. You know, we don't even have to go back many generations to find the problems. But imagine the Israelites are leaving Egypt. God has delivered them. They're out in the Exodus. They're out in the wilderness. And they're hearing their family story for the first time, which is what the book of Genesis is. It's their family history. And if you've been with us the last few weeks with this story of Jacob taking on multiple wives, and it's a disaster, and to realize that's the great story of how we got here. Cool, right? But at the same time, if you're anything like my family, you also kind of have the morals to the story as well, right? And maybe not. Maybe it's just funny that your family was sheep thieves. But like for my family, one thing that I'll carry with me forever is my grandfather died about, unbelievable, he died 20 years ago this year. And one of the last things that he did in his life of any spiritual consequence, I don't know what the final thing that he would have done was before he went to be with Jesus, but he led me to Christ within about 6 months of his death. And I'll remember that forever. And kind of the moral of that story is, if you're alive today, you've got a reason to be alive. God had a reason for him to be alive. He was taken at a relatively young age, but man, he was influential in my life, and especially in that way, he pointed me to Jesus. But in broad terms, these children of Israel would look at this messy, messy story that we're finding ourselves in the midst of. And what they remembered is that God was faithful then, and he is faithful now. And if you really don't take anything else out of this story, what you see is that God is working his purposes. He's never confused. He's never shocked by anything. God is steadily and systematically getting his way all the way along, despite the fact that this family that we're studying is a real mess. And they just can't seem to mess that up. So that's a great truth. God was faithful to them. He continued to be faithful to them. Even Jesus is a sign of his faithfulness to them. And he is faithful to us today, 4,000 years later. Let's read out of verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb. But Rachel was barren And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. And then she ceased bearing. There's 2 sisters in the story, and Rachel isn't mentioned much. But I want to kind of she just gets a short mention, which is that Leah, who's the wife that is actually kind of unloved, starts having kids. But Rachel is just mentioned in passing that she's not able to have kids. And that's really all that we learn about Rachel here. But what we'll see moving forward is both of these sisters have a desperate desire that they just can't have met. Rachel is desperate to have children. We can understand a number of reasons why as we continue to read the story. We're going to see that that's the case. But the first part of that, most of us can understand on some level. In my household, we've had 2 early stage miscarriages. There's probably women in here who have experienced worse than that, either more in number or maybe a baby that came further along. There's a history of stillborn babies in my family. That is a horrible, horrible thing. We can easily overlook that, but we can really understand that desperation. If you've ever had a family or you've been in that situation yourself where you want to have children, but you can't, it's terrible. And they say that infertility really has a similar rate of like depression and anxiety in people that struggle, in women that struggle with infertility, as you see among like cancer patients. With other like really serious illnesses. It deeply, deeply affects us. And many of you know that even more than I do. But what's even worse, and I don't want to minimize that, but what's even worse is that back in the day, there was a lot of social stigma. It wouldn't be unusual for someone to think, oh, maybe God's judging you, and that's why you're not able to have children. Or else you just think, today, hopefully you save well and you can retire with some dignity at some point. Back in those days, if you didn't have children, it was a real question of like, who's going to take care of you when you're no longer able to work and take care of yourself? That was the plan, was that you have some kids that can handle that and help you and take care of you. And so there's a real desperation behind this desire, behind this reality that Rachel can't have children, and it's affecting her deeply. At the same time, we see Leah, she just wants attention. She just wants to actually be loved by her husband. Now let's set aside what happened last week where she tricked Jacob into marrying her in the first place and recognize that this is still a terrible experience, right? You don't always want to empathize with everyone. And maybe you're not inclined to empathize with Leah, but apparently God is inclined to empathize with Leah, so maybe you should. Because she is the sister that actually winds up able to have children. In verse 31, it says that she is hated, that when the Lord saw that she was hated. We learn right before that, at the end of this last account, after Jacob winds up married to both of these sisters, it says that he loved Rachel more than Leah. A neglect like that, that's going to take its toll. And what's revealed, not only in that little hint that he hates her, but and maybe that's not a little hint, right? Hate is a very strong word. But also in the names of these kids, what we see borne out is that really all she wants is Jacob's approval and attention. And she's not getting it. Actually, what we see is that her thankfulness for God will increase, but her expectations of Jacob to actually be a good husband to her just disappear. If you look at the meaning of these names, it's kind of implied in the text here. Reuben means, look, it's a son. But she says in verse 32, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, now my husband will love me. Right? You see two things. She's saying, God gave me this baby, but she's also saying, maybe Jacob will love me now. By the way, I don't think having a baby has ever made any marriage better. Just, little piece of advice there. But that's what she's hoping for. Simeon, the Lord has heard, is what that name means. She says in verse 33, because the Lord heard that I am hated, he has given me a son also. She's saying God is being faithful in the midst of this. Levi means attachment. And she says, well, maybe this time my husband will be attached to me. So he's given up hope, I guess, on a healthy relationship and just wants some kind of attention at this point. And finally, we see Judah. Judah's name means praise. She doesn't have any more expectations of Jacob, but thankfully her heart's been oriented towards God positively. She says, I'm going to praise God because he's given me these children. You see that desperation coming through here. Here's a question that I would have of you today. Are these babies born in a good circumstance? I think the obvious answer is no. This is not a good situation. And maybe in our view of things, our modern, secular 24th century, we would be inclined to maybe say each baby makes the situation worse, right? That tends to be how our modern mindset thinks. But I want you to realize that each time one of these babies is born, it's presented as a gift from God. Despite the circumstances, despite that this is not a good situation, in fact, I challenge you, find me the verse in the Bible where a baby's born, and it's not said that it's a good thing and a good gift from God. By the way, you won't find that verse. It's not there. God likes babies. God likes people. It doesn't matter the circumstances. Clearly, we've got something wrong when we think that maybe it wouldn't be a good situation. Clearly, it's not a good situation for Leah. Leah does not get any emotional attention, but I guess she gets some physical attention, clearly, if you know what I mean. Maybe that just makes it worse. Like there's nothing really about this that's good, but these babies is a good thing. Every time that a baby's born in the Bible, God is acknowledged as the source of that, and it's celebrated as a good thing. Let the hearer who has ears hear. Babies are good. I'm going to just kind of get up on my soapbox for a minute on this, if that's okay. But I've seen some churches, thankfully I've never been in one, that would have somebody that's having a baby maybe in a circumstance that we would say ethically is not a good circumstance. The parents weren't married or something like that. And I've seen churches refuse to do a baby shower in those types of situations. That will never happen here as long as I'm the pastor. Not because we support sin, but because we support life as something that God has given, and it is a gift from God. God doesn't discriminate here. Why would we think that it's our place to do that? We don't have to support whatever ongoing sin is happening to support that God is the giver of life. Every human life is someone that God has made, and they matter because God says so. Is a human being made in God's image. And the reality is, the sad reality of the world that we live in, is I think a lot of evangelicals, and I'm just going to start commenting on some stuff that's going on, think that we've won. But that's not true. The voting hasn't worked. The elections, they haven't been the source of hope that we thought that the pro-life movement would be. There's actually more babies being aborted now, just by a small margin, than there were before Roe v. Wade was overturned. We have not succeeded. If you think that we have, you're deceived. Okay? So take action. That's my encouragement. And I'm just going to speak to this. How about we fix foster care? Let me tell you something. There's more churches in this country than there are children needing homes to live in. That's a sobering reality. If every church could find a way to step forward and take care of one, we wouldn't have a foster system. We wouldn't need it. How about, I love what we do to support our Hope Pregnancy Centers. If you don't know what Hope Pregnancy Centers are, they offer all of the same services as Planned Parenthood, but they don't offer abortions. They support women and they help. And we support that ministry, especially in May around Mother's Day. These are the types of things that maybe move the needle. But man, it's important for us to recognize, don't be pro-life because some party platform says to. Be pro-life because God says that babies matter. God says that everybody is a human being worthy of respect. And there is a lot of work and a lot of prayer and a lot of progress that still needs to be made to that end. Okay? I'm going to get off of my soapbox now. But it's time for us to really pray and think through that. I think so often we find ourselves thinking in a secular way about those issues. No, every human life is sacred, is somebody that God values. That should be driving all of our thoughts on these things. Each one of these babies matters despite the nasty circumstances that they come in. So we keep reading, we find that when Rachel saw that she had borne Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Then she said, "Here's my servant Bilhah. Go into her, that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged me, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, "Good fortune has come." So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, "Happy am I, for women have called me happy." So she called his name Asher. And who ever said that the Bible isn't interesting? Man. Rachel grows to envy her sister. Envy is when you see something good happen to somebody else and it makes you angry. Envy is when you see God blessing someone and all you can think about is that it's not me being blessed. That's what Rachel sees. Really? The unloved wife? No. She doesn't deserve children. I deserve children. And so we see again and again, apparently this family doesn't know how to learn its lesson. Rachel, who had once planned on having this beautiful monogamous life with Jacob, goes ahead and introduces a third female party to this marriage. And it says that gave her to Jacob as a wife. So this is how God understands what's going on there. Again, pay attention. She's dropped all of that. Suddenly it's all about having kids. She has one thing right. God's in control. He gave the baby according to his will, right? Even these babies are recognized as a blessing from God. Every one of them. However, nothing else that she says is right. Not one other thing. She names the first baby boy Dan. And if your name's Dan, sorry, right? But Dan means judged rightly, or like vindicated. So we hear judge and we only hear the bad side of it. It's actually a good word. So when she says God has judged me, what she's saying is like, God has seen what I'm doing and approved of it. No, that's not right at all. She says, God has judged me right, and that's why he's given me this baby. No, that's completely wrong, but that's how she's seeing the picture. And then the birth wars just continue, right? And we have these names, Naphtali, I wrestled and I won, she's like, it's 2-0 now, let's go, and then Leah has these two more babies at her. They're almost like just fighting as to how many babies they can get made here. I imagine it's even more of a mess than the story actually reads, right? I mean, it's just a real disaster if you try and think about this in real life. But Leah's names are good fortune for Gad, and Asher means happy. If you just turn back and read in Genesis 16 what Abraham did with Hagar, who was his servant, this is calling back exactly the kind of abuse that apparently this family is making commonplace. It's easy to look at this and say, oh, wow, like Leah and Rachel are a real mess here and they're not getting it. Yes. But the people that barely go mentioned are these two servant girls. They're not part of this. I don't think that there's any reason to understand them as consensual parties to what's going on here. They're just pawns. I mean, that is a terrible, terrible form of abuse, right? And that is just beyond miserable. And yet, we see that God is sovereign. And God is working out his plan despite their sins. And it goes back to, again, we've landed here a couple different times. But it's just good news that God's plan doesn't count on us. Because God is getting his way. And you look at what these people are doing, and it's horrible. I mean, it's truly beyond horrible, but God is still in control. It's a good thing that God is in control, doing what's best in my life, despite the fact that I sin and make every effort to mess it up. It's a good thing that God is in control. That's what these people are doing. They are really going out of their way to try and ruin things, but God simply doesn't let it happen. God is in charge. He's in control. He's working all of this out for good. Again, imagine you're in the wilderness hearing this family story for the first time. And while it's a story that's a mess, if you're a descendant of Gad or Asher or Dan, you're going, well, I'm here. It must be at least a somewhat good thing. God is working out his purposes and building his people despite the sin of Rachel and Leah and Jacob here. This might be the strangest part of the story, starting in verse 14. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" Rachel said, "Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come into me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me wages because I gave my servant to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. She called his name Zebulun. Afterward, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. If you're confused, good. I think you just should be. It's a strange account. This will help. Mandrakes were considered a powerful aphrodisiac in the ancient world. And so what we see here at best is that Leah is attempting to use medicinal methods to bear children. At worst, what we see here is like some superstition. Maybe this is more like a love potion, witchcraft kind of thing that they're thinking. It's just not great. It's not well thought out. And then the real problem here is, how's it being used? Because what they do is Leah wants to hang on to these and make sure Rachel can't have any kids, but she wants more kids. And so she's refusing to give these mandrakes to her sister. And in the process, Jacob essentially becomes a prostitute. They're just gambling. And interesting, I would say Jacob is just as culpable because he doesn't appear to have any problem with this. I don't understand how he's so passive in all of this, but he just is. He's okay, whatever. It's also implied there, if you're paying careful attention, it seems like Rachel has gone out of her way to make sure that Leah isn't getting any conjugal rights in her marriage at this point. But after selling the mandrakes, they make some kind of deal. Like, does that make sense? And what you see is they're both doing everything they can to win these birth wars. And at the beginning of this episode, it appears that Leah is losing because she's not getting to have sex with Jacob, but Rachel's winning because of that. So Leah looks like she's losing, and then they make this weird trade, and suddenly Leah wins anyway, because what we find out is mandrakes are not a powerful aphrodisiac, and they don't actually do anything. So, whoops. But the sin just continues. The mess that this is making just continues. Leah's mistakes get worse and worse. If you look at the name that she gives her son this time, she names his first son Issachar, which means wages. And she says this, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. Okay. First off, Leah, God does not owe you anything. I don't know where she got that idea from, but we can understand because we all get the same idea that God might owe us something from time to time. No, God does not owe her anything. And second off, he certainly doesn't approve of what she's done. Leah makes a common mistake that I think a lot of us do from time to time, and that's thinking that because she's getting what she wants, it means she has God's approval. Well, that's not quite how it works. It's not necessarily a sign. In fact, if you just read the book of Job, you find out that hardship is not necessarily a sign of God's judgment. At the same time, being blessed is not necessarily a sign of God's approval either. God makes the sun rise on the evil and the good, Jesus says. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. Just because something is going good, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing the right thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that God approves, but Leah seems to think it does. How about this? It's simple. God is faithful to us, and we should just be faithful with him, regardless of the circumstances. We don't need some kind of payment. God doesn't owe us anything. God blesses us because he's good, and it's just who he is. This is out of Habakkuk chapter 3. It says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit on the vines, nor the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock has been cut off from the fold, and there's been no herd in the stalls. In other words, nothing in life is going right at all. Habakkuk says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. We should never think that God owes us anything. We should never think that just because things are going well with us means that we're doing things right. In fact, there might be a good argument to think quite the opposite. It might be that it's Satan that fools us with the nice things in life, and God calls us to be faithful regardless of the circumstances. In the end, really, Leah's just bragging at this point. I'm going to give you these last couple names just because I've given you all the rest. Zebulun means endowment or honor. She says, God has honored me, or God has given me these things, and now my husband will honor me. She's back to still just hoping Jacob will pay attention to her. And then she has Dinah, which means justice or vindication. It just keeps spiraling out of control. We're picking up in verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. Our last name Joseph means God has added to me. So we wind up in a situation where finally the thing that Rachel wants happens, but at what cost? Rachel has done everything that she possibly can. She has prevented Leah from having children in every way that she can. She has done everything that she has been able to think of, good, bad, or indifferent, and there's a little bit of all of it, to have a child. And in the end, she's just found that absolutely nothing works. She's come to the end of herself. She's given up. And when she gives up, when she's at her lowest place, when there's no hope, when she's finally learned this just isn't going to happen, then we read verse 22, God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. If you go back to chapter 29, verse 31, it says the exact same thing of Leah. Verse 31, that when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb. But Rachel was barren. So we see both of these sisters, God visits them in their time of need. We see the same thing of Hagar. Hagar is another servant that gets mistreated and abused, and she's alone in the wilderness at her lowest point trying to take care of this baby and doesn't know what to do. And that's where God finds her, because it's just who God is. And he cares. He cares about our hardships. He cares about our sufferings. And he finds both of these sisters in their pain. It's because God cares and God loves his people. The first words here are that God remembered. Then God remembered Rachel. All throughout Genesis and right to the beginning of Exodus too. Those words, God remembered, happen at pivotal moments where we see God's faithfulness to his people. First time it shows up is it says in chapter 8, it says God remembered Noah. At that point, Noah and his family were faithful. They were already on the ark. They were already being spared the flood, but they had been on the ark for a long time. And wouldn't that have been a life if the floodwaters rose and they never went down? And I guess the population could only be as big as that boat. I don't know. But they realized we got a problem here. Verse 1 of chapter 8, God remembered. And that's the point at which he begins to let the floodwaters drain and he relents from his wrath. In chapter 19, God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. because not one righteous person is found. But at the end of that chapter, we're told God remembered Abraham. And Abraham, all throughout that chapter, is just praying for God to spare his nephew Lot. That's what God does. He's faithful. He's faithful to Abraham in that instance. In the beginning of Exodus, in Exodus chapter 2, we learn how bad these Israelites have it. The story will go on. All of these sons will turn on their youngest brother Joseph and throw him in a well. Like, that's a Sunday school story that we know. But what goes on from there is God providentially takes care of Joseph, places him in charge in Egypt, and this whole family winds up in Egypt. But they wind up becoming this large people that becomes oppressed. Over the course of about 400 years, they're stuck in Egypt, and God finds them being enslaved and brutally mistreated. And in Exodus chapter 2, it says God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he goes on and he rescues the Israelites from slavery. God hears the cry of the people that can't help themselves. God hears the cry of people in need because it's just who he is. And it's been 4,000 years and nothing has changed. It's been 4,000 years and God still hears the cry of the lowly. You could think of it and you would be right this way, that even God sending Jesus is because we're helpless and he knows it. In Romans 3:23, we learn all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. No exceptions, no excuses. We're completely helpless. We can't honor God. We can't be with God on our own. God knew that. He took care of that. The greatest love was shown in this, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Even the ministry of Jesus shows God's heart for the helpless. And here's the thing that we need to understand. We're the helpless. We're the ones that are in need. Whether you've got money or not, whether you've got a good house to live in or not, it doesn't really matter. You're helpless on your own. That's the truth. And God cares. Jesus has always been the best news to the lowly. All throughout the Gospel of Luke, like, that's made really, really clear. Even when Jesus' birth is announced to Mary, this is what Mary's song is. She says in chapter 1, she says, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior." Why? Because he has looked upon the humble estate of his servant. It's no accident that the first people that the shepherds show up to and say, "Glory, glory." Jesus is coming, and they give this good news. It's the shepherds. It's the lowly people. And then in the end, when Jesus gives his mission statement, when he goes to the synagogue and he reads out of Isaiah, listen to how good of news this is to people who can't help themselves. This is how Jesus understands his ministry. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." There's no such thing as not good enough. There's no such thing as too far gone. There's no such thing as too hopeless or too helpless. You look at the lives that God can turn around, at the way that God can take broken people and make them whole, and messy things and clean them up and make them beautiful. That's what God has done for us. And if you're here today and you're without Christ, the bad news is you're helpless and you're hopeless. And outside of him, there really is no chance. That thing that you've been missing, that thing that makes life empty, it's Jesus. Trust me, I looked in other places. If we went around and told the stories, we could tell you about how the drugs and the alcohol and all that other stuff, and maybe it's not something bad, maybe it's just something good, maybe it's just the friends and family, how none of that actually fulfills the need that we have for purpose and meaning in our lives. It's only in Jesus. We are helpless, and God knows it, and He cares, and He saw them then, and He sees us now. And He is faithful. He has never stopped being faithful. So if you're in this room today and you think that you've messed up too much, I don't care how long you've been in church. I don't care if you've never been in church before. You haven't. Because, by the way, the faithful people mess up too. If you've learned anything from this family, Jacob is God's chosen. And Jacob is a wreck. But God uses him despite his sin. If you're here today and you're looking for hope and purpose and meaning, the bad news is you won't find it on your own. The good news is you can find it in Christ. If you've never trusted in Him today, I'd love to talk to you about that. Let's pray.